In this lecture, I'll be demonstrating the grab brush, and we'll be adding some horns in, also looking at the snake hook tool and the inflate brush. So here's where we got up to last time, and I just want to show you a very useful tool that lots of 3D artists rely on, and that's the mask tool. If I scroll down along my brushes, you can see a mask brush here. The shortcut is M because it's quite often used. And let's say I wanted to edit my top eyelid. I'll just quickly go back to the grab brush for this to demonstrate. If I make my brush bigger and start moving the top eyelid, you can see that the bottom eyelid is slightly moving as well. However, if I use the mask brush, and let's say mask the bottom eyelid out like this, and that's just painting on, pressing and holding left mouse button. I can now press G to go to the grab brush, because again that's used quite often. I'll resize my brush, make it nice and big, and I'm just affecting the top eyelid and a tiny bit of this area here which I missed with my mask, as you can see there. So that's a very useful tool. I'll give you another example, and I'll clear this mask by pressing Alt-M to clear the mask. You can also find the mask tools up here. So clear mask is Alt-M just there. Let's say I wanted to put some horns on this character. I'll resize my brush with F, and let's paint a little area here. Oh, I'll click on the actual mask brush and paint a little area just there. Now I want to affect only this area, but that's masked out at the moment. You may have noticed under the mask menu there's invert mask as well, which is Control I. So I'll press Control I and that inverts the mask, and now this area is what I can affect. I could then go to maybe the grab brush and resize, make it nice and big, and I can just pull that out like this. It's going the wrong way slightly though. I'm going to undo that and show you another brush, which is the snake hook brush. And again, I'll come around to the side here and pull this out. The snake hook, you can kind of curve your mesh like this, which is quite fun. So he's got some funny horns there. Now the problem with this, of course, is that I've stretched my mesh and I would have to do a remesh, which would lose a bit of the details within here. If I press Control R now, you can see I lose a little bit of those details that I made. But I would have a little bit more detail on the horns up here. But hopefully that highlights the mask brush for you. Now another way we can do the horns, if I undo all those steps, I don't have to use the mask brush or really edit my mesh at all. I will just go back to the grab brush and make an area, sort of a slight protrusion where the horns might go, so somewhere around here. And things like horns or maybe an earring on the goblin's ears, they don't have to be sculpted in. A lot of the time it's much easier just to add a new mesh. So I'll go back to object mode, shift right click to move my 3D cursor to here, shift A to add, and it doesn't matter too much what I add, maybe a UV sphere. I'll scale that down so it's in the right position, and then go across to sculpting. So Control Tab, across to sculpt mode. It needs a bit of a finer mesh, so I can press Control R to do a remesh. But just a quick note on that, if I go back to object mode quickly and press N on my keyboard and go to item, I've scaled it down lots. If I press Control A now and apply my scale, then go back to sculpt mode and Control R to do a remesh, you can see it's doing a remesh based on its new size, which is the correct size. So just be a little bit aware of that. I'll undo that, press Shift R, and I can bring my voxel size down to something like this, and then Control R to remesh. So take a moment to catch up with me and add in a new object to sculpt your horn with. And remember about the scale, so you might need to change the voxel value. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now I can use that fun snake hook tool, resize my brush slightly and create some funny kind of horns like this. Control R to do a remesh, smooth out a touch, and that looks quite fun. Might have to angle these slightly across here and smooth out just a touch more, and that looks quite fun. Maybe have that pointing upwards slightly like this. And I feel like it's getting too thin at the end, so I can use the inflate brush, and that inflates your mesh, especially if you've smoothed it out lots when it goes to a point. So if I smooth out loads, it goes to a point, you can use the inflate brush to bring it back and give it some substance. I'll just smooth out a bit there, smooth out a touch more at the end, and I've got a wiggly sort of horn. I still feel like I want to edit it a bit more, so I'll get the grab brush and put it around, try and experiment with a few shapes and see what different things might look like, a bit more curl, a bit more wave, something like this maybe. I'll do a final remesh, so Control R, just because I've moved it around a lot, and then I'll mirror it to the other side. But before I do that, catch up with me adding that twist and turn to your horn. Now the correct way to do the mirror at the moment is to use the mirror modifier and the man as the mirror object. You might be tempted to come up to the symmetry options up here and think it's, well, positive x to minus x, or jump to the other side. However, if I do that, it's jumping over here because my object origin for this object is in the middle there. So I'll undo that. That's why I need to go to the add modifier down here, add modifier and mirror modifier, and then use the picker to select the head and therefore use the head's object origin to bring the horn to the other side. Now I've got some interesting looking horns. I might go into object mode, I think, and perhaps scale them up. The object origin's in a nice spot for this, to scale them up to a different size like this. And remember to press Ctrl A to set the scale, therefore your remesh will make sense. If you want to go to sculpt mode and start pulling them about again, if you want a bit more windy kind of horns. And a quick remesh with Ctrl R, and we got some interesting horns there. I still feel like they need a tiny bit of work, so maybe I'll go back to the snake hook tool and see if I can't twist them around into a different position. That looks a bit more evil, doesn't it? They look a bit distorted now though, so I'm going to have to try and sort them out slightly. Smooth out a bit, Ctrl R to do a remesh, and I can always use that inflate to inflate areas if I need. Another remesh, and then Ctrl R to smooth those out. That's a bit more like it, I think, and they look quite fun. Now your character doesn't have to have horns, but it's just a way of showing off the different brushes. But take a moment here to catch up with me if you want to put some in, and of course make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture we'll be adding some character to our sculpt. I'll be showing you a few new brushes and encouraging you to be experimental with the final aspects of your model. So here's where we got up to last time, and you might be very happy with your sculpt at this point, but for those that are interested in taking their sculpts that little bit further, I'm going to show you a couple of brushes and some handy shortcuts to make the final level of detail stage a little bit faster and fun. Now it may be that you're really happy with your sculpt as it is, and you're just desperate to get on with the colouring, then jump to the next video. But if you want to learn a little bit more and take your sculpt that little bit further, then stick around. Do of course make sure you've saved your work at this point, because the next stage is what we call destructive, and I'll remind you about that in a second. So first of all, I'm in sculpt mode for the horns, so if I press Ctrl Tab and go to object mode, you can see I've still got the horns selected, and if I wanted to start sculpting on the actual head, I'd have to select the head, Ctrl Tab, back into sculpt mode. It's not particularly long-winded, but if I zoom in a little bit, so it's easier to select, I can actually press Alt and Q over the top of different objects if I want to jump to that object. So Alt Q, and can you see how it highlighted red, and now I'm in sculpt mode for this object, so I could start sculpting like this with the inflate brush. I'll undo that though, and Alt Q if I want to go back to the head, and you can see again it flashes red there. Now with the head selected, I think it would be helpful to have some sort of link between the head and the horn. It's just sticking out and it's completely flat. I think there'd be some sort of growth around here. So I'm just going to go to the draw brush for this and make my brush a bit smaller and create some sort of growth around that area like this. So the skin kind of works its way around the horn slightly. I'll tidy that up just a touch, maybe make my brush a little bit smaller and come around a little bit finer here, somewhere around there. It's a little bit wobbly at the moment, so I'll make my brush a bit bigger and smooth out a touch. And that looks much better, I would say. So just pause the video here and take a moment to practice jumping from one object to another in sculpt mode with Alt Q. And then with the head selected, just sculpt a bit of growth out towards the horn so it attaches to the head a little bit better. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, I'm going to press Alt Q and select the horn now. I want to show you a new brush, the Draw Sharp brush. Now this is a little bit like the crease brush, and I'll zoom in on my horn to show you this and make my brush nice and small and draw a line with that. And you can see it does literally that, draws a line, it digs in as opposed to many brushes that pull outwards, and it's quite sharp as you can see there. And we can create some grains on our horns. But before I continue, I'm going to undo those two, and you can see that it's a little bit blobby, grainy, noisy, whatever you might want to call that. So we need to up the topology for our horn a little bit. So I'll undo that and Shift R, and I'll bring this down to 0.008, somewhere around there, and then Control R. It's not actually many faces for this because this is a very small object, so it's only 22,000. So most computers should handle that. And let's try it now, see how that goes. It's not too bad, but let's go a little bit further. So Shift R, and then maybe down to 0.007 instead, and Control R. I'll come in again. It's still a little bit blocky. It's fine from a bit of a distance, about here. And by all means, you can go a bit finer with your remesh. I'm just trying to make this as accessible for as many people as possible and showing you what you can do with not too many faces. Also, when I go across to object mode, so Control Tab, object mode, I can right click and shade smooth, and you can see it's not looking too bad then. And that will be the final look of our horn. So I'll go back into sculpt mode and start sculpting some of these grains here. You don't have to go all the way up and down, but something like this should work okay. Remember, you have got the active tools and workspace settings here to change the strength, or you can press Shift F and you can increase the strength like this or decrease the strength this way by moving your mouse side to side. And 0.5 is the default, which seems to work quite well for most brushes. I do find this type of work much easier on a graphics tablet. I'm still using the mouse though. But if you're really into sculpting, then you might want to buy a graphics tablet. You can also do sort of circular bits like this, makes it more sort of woody, sort of like knots and eyes, that sort of thing. And that looks quite interesting, I think. So pause the video here and have a go with the Draw Sharp brush. Do remember you might need to increase the resolution of your horns before you do that. Okay, so I'll show you a few more brushes and I'll sculpt the main head for this, so Alt Q, and you see him flashing red there. Now we've seen the inflate brush and we could make a sort of wart on the side of his face like this. That's not too bad, although I've accidentally brushed across the back there, so I'll make the brush a little bit bigger and something like that would look great. But it doesn't look right when you've got exactly the same on the other side. So I'll undo that. So at this point, it's a great idea to turn symmetry off. You will probably want to save your work here because it's a point where it's kind of difficult to recover from and it can make quite a big influence to your mesh. So if I turn off symmetry, we could use the inflate brush to create a funny sort of wart type thing there. It's a bit big actually, so I'll make it a little bit smaller, something like that. You can use the blob brush as well. That might be a little bit easier, maybe one on the nose just here. And you can see that was much quicker and faster than the inflate brush. The blob brush is particularly good at those sort of lumps and bumps. The inflate brush is more for bringing the mesh out, like I was showing you with the horns earlier. I'll put one down here as well, I think, and maybe one on the brow line this side. Is that too many? It looks very warty now. Might be too many, but you can have a bit of fun with this. At this point as well, if I show you my reference images, and I'll zoom in particularly on these two here, you can see that they've got a lot of character to them and their shape is very different from one side to the other. It really moves away from being symmetrical. And I personally quite like that look. So we can get our grab brush and start playing with the mesh a bit. So I'll make my brush nice and big and maybe raise this eyebrow up. Just be careful you don't grab the bottom of the eye. You might want to use masking if you're finding that difficult. But just to speed things up, we can do it without masking. I want to flesh a little bit out here, so I'm just smoothing it out. So it's got one eyebrow raised, and maybe just squint this one a little bit more to exaggerate that. Often when you raise an eyebrow, your lips go up with it. So this whole sort of skin area here moves up with it. We can make the nose all crooked, like this. And we could even make the chin crooked, going perhaps across this way, and just add a little bit of distortion almost to the head shape. So it's not nice and symmetrical. And that looks quite interesting there. I haven't gone too far, and you could really go for it and have all sorts of distortion here like this. Again, you might want to mask at some point in case you don't want to affect the eyelids a bit too much. But that looks quite interesting in itself. It's definitely worth experimenting and trying things out and see how you get on. I think it was a bit better earlier on, so I'll undo some of those stages, but I like some aspects. So a little bit more of a frown coming down here, and perhaps just coming in a little bit just here. Somewhere around there, I think, is looking kind of interesting. Maybe even more of a squint in this eye over here. I might have to just lift that eyelid up a little bit. And how are we getting on? That's kind of fun. I feel like the jaw is a little bit wide, so I might bring these in. He seems a bit boring from this side at the moment, so perhaps we can bring the chin around a little bit more, maybe something like this. I feel like the mouth's a little bit out, so I'm actually going to try out a kind of frown grumpy look like this instead. I've distorted my mole a little bit, so I'll have to bring that back there. I could always just smooth out and add the mole again in a minute. And let's bring that side down like this, smooth out just a touch. I think I kind of prefer that actually, that looks a bit more fun. And let's add in, with our blob brush, a wart. And smooth out around here. That's great fun. But again, you can have a bit of fun with this and experiment for yourself. So this is the last part of the sculpting phase, and we'll go on to the painting and lighting stages in the next lectures. So as a challenge to you, I'd like you to have a go at distorting the face, pulling it around, experimenting a bit, and seeing what you come up with. Make sure you've saved your work before you do that, and just be really free and pull it around, create some real character to your model. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work as a separate file just to be sure, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll learn about how we can paint our sculpts to add even more character and realism to our models. In this lecture, I go fairly detailed into the types of colours needed for a stylized character like this. Don't panic if you can't quite get there or yours doesn't look similar to mine. Just try and enjoy the process and experiment. So here's where we got up to last time. And in order to add colour to our objects, there's an option down the bottom called Paint. Now it's important to mention that there is another way of painting objects within Blender, and that's called texture painting, and it even has its own workspace up here. The reason I'm not using that and using a specific one for sculpting is that this is an extremely high poly mesh with 750,000 faces. In order to use texture painting, you need to unwrap your mesh, which we've talked about in previous units, but because it's so high poly, it's not advised to try that within Blender. For most machines, it will just crash if you try and unwrap a model of this size. Also, if you use the texture painting to paint on it, even if it is unwrapped, it will lag a lot and it won't respond well. However, the painting within sculpt mode means we don't have to do any of that. It is of course important to say at this point, if you wanted to use this character in a game, then this sort of high poly count would be ill-advised also. Because they're such high poly meshes, they take more processing power to render, they take more memory to store, and they're more awkward to rig, and so on. But the paint mode that we have available to us in sculpting is very clever. It uses something along the lines of vertex painting as I understand it, which gives a paint value to each vertex on your model. And for that reason, they're able to make it run a lot smoother and faster in sculpt mode. And you can come up with some very effective results. So with my paint option enabled, I'll change the color, which is up the top here. You can also change it in the sidebar over here. And I'll scroll down just a touch because there's also a color picker here. And it's useful to have this open, and I'll show you why in a moment. First of all, let's change it up here to start with, and I'll change it to a sort of pinky reddy color, and you can see it changing up here and in here as well. And I'll change it so it's a little bit darker, so it's sort of quite dark reddy colored skin somewhere around here. And let's start painting that on. And you can see it paints fairly quickly, there's no lag, and it's doing a great job. We can also turn X symmetry on, but do be aware we've changed the symmetry slightly so it won't always be precise, but it will speed things up a bit. So I'll use that to paint. Notice though, when I paint the second time, it gives a deeper red. That's because the strength of our brush up here is only at 0.6. You can change that in the same way as any brush, so I can press Shift F for the strength and turn it up to 1 and fill him in with this reddy color. Now, you might be thinking that is extremely red, and perhaps be thinking that I'm going for a sort of devil character. Well, yes, I am going for a reddish colored character, but it's actually down to the way it's displayed in solid mode. If I go to material preview mode, we can't actually see anything. And I'll explain why in a moment, but I'll go back to solid mode for now, and I want you to catch up with me, painting your character's head a similar color to what I have here. And that's not what I've got in the viewport, but in my color options down here. Remember, you need to be in paint mode for this, and you've also got your tools at the top here for the strength and size of your brush. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll go across to the shading workspace to explain a bit more about the color. Let's zoom in on our character, and because our character is upright, we might as well join these two together, bring these out, and join these two together, and change this to the shader editor. I'll press N to get rid of that panel, and I'll zoom in on our character a touch. This is a much more sensible workspace for a character that's upright like this. I'll add a new material for the head, and I'll label it head, and you can see my nodes just here. So we've got a base color, and that's shown in our object. So how do we get hold of the information that we had in the sculpting workspace? I'll go back to shading, and Well, that's in a special location. If I go to the object data properties here, you can see that there's a color attributes option here. And if I click on that drop down, we've got this new color option here. If I were to delete that, I would delete my red that I have painted. So as soon as you start painting, it creates one of these for you. So we need to hook this up to the base color of our node. For that, I can press Shift A to add, and under input, as you'd expect, there's a attribute just here, but we're not looking for that. We're looking for the color attribute just here. So I'm going to click on that, bring that to the front and hook it up. And it changes to our not so ready color. Now it's important to note, if I zoom into the color attribute, that there's a box down the bottom here. And if I click on that, I can choose my color, and that is the same. It's assuming because there's only one color attribute on this object that we want to use that. But it's a good idea to actually say which one you want, because you could have several in here, and you can add new ones here if you wanted to paint several different styles of head. So now we've got a color on our character, we can go back to the sculpting workspace and jump to material preview mode, and that looks a lot more pinky like skin. And in fact, I might go a little bit more red across to here, so he's a little bit more devilish, and make sure he's completely covered in this. Checking the back of the ears as well, make sure you get those. And also down the bottom there. So pause the video and catch up with me. I'll go back to the shading workspace so you can see the node set up. It's the color attribute node, and remember you can search for these nodes. If I press Shift A, there's the search option there as well, but it is under input and color attribute. I'll go back to the sculpting workspace, so pause the video and catch up with me. Okay, so now comes the fun part. But before you start painting, there's a really useful option down the bottom here. It's called Color Palette. I'll open that up and I'll click New. So we created a new color palette there. And if I press the plus sign here, that stores this color we have in here. That's really useful because I might start painting with a different color and then think, oh, I want to use that color to go back over the new color that I've made. And it's difficult to select that exact color. So storing it in your color palette makes it much easier. And I can just click on it and it will pop in here if that were a different color. So for example, if I chose a more reddy color, so cheeks are often red, the nose is often red, and the ears. So I'll paint those in a bit red. It's got a bit of a reddy color there, and I'll make it a little bit darker somewhere down here and bring my strength down to about 5-ish and just paint across the middle there. So he's got a sort of red middle bit more on the cheeks, bit more on the nose, and a little bit more on the ears. Just make the brush a little bit smaller so I can be a little bit more precise. And you can see I've got some on the skull there. I'm not going to worry too much for the moment. Just get those ears nice and red, the nose around the bottom here nice and red. So I've got a red middle. And now I want to get rid of this red up here. So first of all, I'll save that red. So I'll press the plus sign on that. And I can go back to my original color and kind of erase that by painting over it with the original color. That's basically how you erase colors when you're coloring in this sort of method. And already it's looking quite interesting. So pause the video here and catch up with me creating your color palette, painting the middle section a reddish color, and perhaps a little bit extra on the cheeks, the nose, and the edge of the ears here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's paint the lips. So I'll go a little bit more red, slightly towards the purples this way in my color wheel, and a little bit darker somewhere around here. It's a bit of a stylized character this, and let's paint that in and see how that looks. Not too bad. I might have to turn symmetry off now though, because we're getting a little bit more detailed. It's not quite precise, so I'll come down to this side here. Let's turn this strength up to 1 so that I can paint that on a little bit more clearly. So somewhere around here, a little bit tricky this with a mouse, much easier with a graphics tablet. Let's get into there and try and paint this. I'll speed this up just a touch. Okay, we've got to be a bit careful because it looks a little bit like a very elaborate pantomime character. So I'll save that color with the plus and go back to my original skin color, bring the strength right down, brush a bit bigger, and just tone it down a bit in some areas. As I was saying, it kind of works like an eraser. That's just about working. I'll go back to this one, strength up just a touch, and refine it very slightly, just in here. And that's not looking too bad. Bit at the top there, needs removing, and there's a bit of red in there as well to make it even more difficult. But with a low strength, you can kind of blend these things together, and that's not looking too bad. There is also a smear brush here, which you can use to blend things together, and if I turn the strength down, it does a much softer job. So if you do need to use the smear brush to kind of help you with some of these areas, blur them just a touch, make them blend into each other, then that can be quite helpful. I'll go back to the paintbrush now. So pause the video here and catch up with me painting the lips in a sort of purpley colour. Okay, I'll scroll down to my palette again, and with that purple colour, I'll increase the strength to about 0.6, and this is very useful for creating bags under the eyes like this. I'll undo that actually because I might get away with the X symmetry on this one. Just make it a little bit faster. So you've got sort of bags under his eyes like that, and that's working reasonably well. I'll turn the strength down a bit further and go around a little bit further around the outside, and I'm getting away with the symmetry there, so that's good. We could also create a little bit of shading in the ears like this with that purple colour as well. Perhaps even under the nose, just there as well. So you can paint a little bit of shadow on, although the lighting will do that a little bit later, so you don't have to worry too much about that. So pause the video here and work on the eyes, and shade in the areas where you want a little bit more shadow, but don't worry too much about that. Okay, now interestingly, most faces, when you're painting them, they have this red bit across the middle. The bottom part tends to be a little bit more blue, especially for males. So we'll go over to the blues over here. I'm going sort of around the circle this way. And if I hold down Control and use the wheel, I can actually make this area a bit bigger so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And that's holding down Control and using the wheel if you need to change the size of the menus. So from the reds here and the skin colours here, I'm going around the circle towards the blues. So I'm keeping the same saturation level, but heading towards the blues. Might make it a little bit darker as well. Brush nice and big, low strength of about 0.25, and I'll just brush in here, giving some of that darkness, that sort of bluey colour. Might go a little bit further round, possibly exaggerating a little bit here. But remember, you can always tone this back by adding that to your colour palette and then going back to your more pinky colours and bringing those in. It's not too bad, but I still feel it's not quite blue enough, so I'll come around a little bit further into somewhere around here. It might be a touch too dark as well. That's a bit better. That's what I'm looking for, sort of blue like this. Not too far down the neck, and in fact you can use some of this red, but first remember to add this colour. So add the colour and then add a bit of this red to the chest area here, like so, and we can do the same sort of thing at the back. And that's working relatively well. I'm finding the skin a little bit shiny, so I'll just go across to the shading mode and bring the roughness of my principled BSDF up, and that's looking a little bit better, I think. Let's go back to sculpting. That's a bit more like it. It's a bit less distracting. So pause the video here, catch up with me and add some blue to the chin area. Don't worry if it goes too far, you can always tone it back later. So we have a bluey colour, which I've exaggerated a bit here, and I might tone that back in a moment. Then a reddy colour in the middle, and you actually go for a yellowy colour at the top. So I'll go across the yellows, a little bit brighter. In fact, I'll choose this one here first, just to look at the brightness and then come across the yellows. So I want it roughly the same brightness as the original one here. So I've got that there. Again, not too high a strength, and just come across to the top with a bit of that yellow. Might be a bit too strong there. Something like this anyway. Still feel like my brush is a little bit strong actually. That's better. Just a subtle bit of yellow. It's not really that subtle at the moment, but we're getting there. I can just go back to my original colour, very low strength, so under 0.1, and I can just add a little bit of that original colour just to kind of soften this out, this effect. And I made a classic mistake. I didn't add that yellow to the colour palette. It's around here, I know that much, so I can add it in now. And I've got my colours here, and at any time I want to increase them. I think a bit more red around the cheeks now. I'll just increase the strength a touch here to about 0.1, and then a little bit more strength, that red around here, and around the nose, and around the ears. And take out a tiny bit of this blue. It's a little bit too much at the moment. The mirror, as you can see, is not quite accurate here, so it's adding more to this side than this side. So I'll have to turn that off, and just do some of this by hand. That's absolutely fine. And I need a little bit more on the lips. So this sort of reddy colour. Again, a nice low strength, and I'll just increase these middle bits a little bit more, a little bit darker, right in the crevice, I think. As I've said before, a lot of that will be picked up by the lighting as well, but I always like to paint a little bit of extra shadow in these crevices. You don't really have to do this, It just adds a little bit of vibrancy to your models, so don't worry too much if you're finding this bit a bit tricky. One last thing, a little bit of darkness under the nose here, adding a little bit of shadow, especially in the nostril areas there. I might go really dark on this. Okay, so hopefully you're getting on okay with this, and as usual, catch up with me. Try your best to get relatively close to what I've got here. And of course, don't panic if it doesn't look exactly like mine, but this is roughly what you're heading towards. Again, experiment a bit, try and enjoy the process, and have some fun. And of course, remember to save your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be finishing off the character with the eyes and the horns and just adding a few finishing touches to the face. So here's where we got up to last time. We need to texture the horns and the eyes and maybe just touch up a tiny bit on the face once those aspects are in. So let's go across to the shading workspace and I'll select the eyes and zoom in on those with period key. And I'll zoom right into here and into edit mode. And because we've rotated this UV sphere around the x-axis like this, we've got a nice setup for making this middle bit the pupil and the bit around it the iris and then the rest of it white. And I want to challenge you to have a go at creating that. So you'll want 3 color slots, one with a black, one with an iris color, maybe red in this case, or a menacing green, something like that. And then the other one on the outside to be white. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. So first of all, I'll create a new material, that's slot 1, and I'll just bring this window out slightly so you can easily see what I'm naming things, and I'll call this eyes white. So we need 2 more slots, so 1, 2, and for the second one, I'll create a new material and call this eyes red, I think I'll choose, for the iris, and then the last one, new material, and eyes black for the pupils. Then I have to go in and obviously change the colors. So I'll bring the black down to the black, and also I'll bring the roughness right down to 0 so it's nice and shiny. And I'll go to face mode, select those middle faces just there, and under the slots, choose assign. So we've got the pupil there. Let's go to the red now. I'll change this to a red color, somewhere around here, maybe a little bit darker, bring the roughness down, and Alt left click on this face loop around here, up to the slots and choose assign. And we've got a red color. Last, I'm just going to go to slot 1 with the white and just decrease the whiteness slightly. If it's too white, it's a little bit bright. It looks a bit strange because it's yellow at the moment, but if I come out of edit mode, then we've got these menacing red eyes. And of course, at this point, we could go to slot 2 and perhaps experiment, see what green eyes look like, purple eyes, blue eyes, whatever you fancy. I think menacing red eyes like this could go a little bit darker, maybe somewhere around here. Looks quite good. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Now, one thing you might notice if we zoom right in is that we've still got flat shading on the face and the eyes, but I think I might have put smooth shading on the horns. I can't quite remember, but I'll just select all, right click, shade smooth. Now we've got smooth shading everywhere and we can't see those lumps and bumps. So that's good. And let's just texture the horns. So I'll create a new material, name these horns, and let's change that to a sort of browny reddy color, somewhere around here with a bit of darkness. And that looks fairly good. Let's just deselect that. I quite like that. Shiny horns or rough horns, I think somewhere in the middle looks about right. Excellent. Okay, so pause the video and catch up with me, making sure you've textured the horns and added smooth shading to everything. I'll just position my head back in the center here. And I haven't actually painted the moles that we've got around the place. So I can select the head and go back to sculpt mode. And I'll scroll down my brush, probably a browny color somewhere around here, fairly dark. Zoom in a touch. Remember, you can press Alt left click to zoom in on an area. And I'll give that a bit of brown, up the strength of the brush a little bit. Something like that. Let's make that a little bit wider. Oh, I've gone over the edge slightly there. That looks okay. I'm just going smaller and smaller with my brush to make sure that the very end is sort of more dark than the other parts. This one's a little bit tricky because it's sort of a strange wide shape. Let's just see how we're getting on there. That's not too bad. Let's just go to the next one. And there we go. And maybe I'll make this one a bit more of a reddy color just to see what sort of difference that makes. Sometimes if you zoom out early, you get a little bit of a line. So if I'm pressing this and then zoom out, sometimes creates a little bit of a line. That's a bit of a bug. So I'll just come in and finish this off again, just in there. There we go. So pause the video and catch up with me and paint in your moles or warts or whatever they might be. I feel like this one here is just super big, so I'm going to add a bit of red on the outside of it, as if it's a bit inflamed. I'll press the Alt middle mouse button to make it a little bit easier to paint that in. There we go. Now lastly, just as a touch up, I think the eyes could be a little bit darker, make them look a bit more sunken. So I'll come to that purple colour around about here, maybe a little bit darker, and across a bit further to the purples. Just check my strength, 0.2 should be fine, and I can turn symmetry on for this because the eyes are reasonably symmetrical. And just come across the eyes like this. Let's just have a look at what that looks like. That's not too bad. I can use the smear brush if I need to just smear that out a touch, and I prefer that. There is one more thing, actually. The horns don't seem to blend in with the skull, so I'm going to go back to the paint and use this sort of reddy colour here. Come into the horns, and still got symmetry on, remember, so this will be happening on the other side, and just add a little bit of red to there. Hopefully that makes a bit more sense, that sort of protrusion now. I'll bring the strength down, make my brush very big, and just red that area, round it up a little bit as well. I think that makes a bit more sense. Just a tiny bit more red around here, so it's not quite so yellowy up the side there. And there we go. Okay, so a few minor touch-ups there. So pause the video and catch up with me making any minor adjustments like I've done here. Now the last thing I want to look at is just across at the render settings, so the render properties just here. I'll just zoom out a touch so you can see them all with Control middle click, and I just want to see the effects of the ambient occlusion. So I'll just tick that, and you can see all these crevices around the place getting filled in. So if I turn it off and on, you can see that makes quite a difference. And I'll open up the dialog and just change the distance very slightly, give it a bit of a boost like this. I'm at about 40 centimeters there, and I think that's about right. You have to be a bit careful. If you go too high, you get these sort of strange areas of ambient occlusion which don't quite make sense, like under the neck there, and that's not necessary. So 0.4 seemed to be fairly optimal. So once again, turn that off and on just to see what that looks like, and that's really helping our mesh. So catch up with me and just experiment a little bit with your ambient occlusion. It does depend on the size of your mesh, but it's probably fairly similar to mine, so 0.4 should work quite well. Once you've done that, make sure you saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll look at the 3-point lighting system, a really excellent way of showing off single models to their full potential. So here's where we got up to last time, and in order to set up the lighting, I'm going to first take you to the shading workspace, and just under the world settings, I'm going to show you that I've got a very basic grey background as the default. So if I go across to rendered mode, it will look something like this, and we've got a light in our scene just up there, which is giving us this light. So I thought I'd start by showing you that there's nothing special about this scene, and we're going to set up for 3-point lighting. We could use the shading workspace, but it's possibly easier in the layout workspace. We don't need the timeline, so I'll get rid of that, and I'll open up a new window. This one I'll make the camera view, and this one just leave it as the 3D view to set up our lights. So I'll go into camera view, press N on my keyboard, and go to view and then lock camera to view. I'll press N again to clear that and move my camera into a suitable position. Just somewhere nice and simple like this. Maybe we can chop off just the bottom section there. I'll press N again to turn off lock camera to view, and N again to remove that menu, and then I can zoom into this and get a better view. I'll press T to get rid of the side panel here. I'll come across to render preview, and I'll turn off the overlays and the gizmos on the right hand side. So we've got a nice clear view of our character. In fact, I'm just going to move the camera slightly closer because it's a little bit far out. Just there, that's perfect. And I'll turn off lock camera to view in case I accidentally go out of camera view. I can easily get it back with 0. So on this side, I want to set up our lights. But before I do that, just catch up with me, setting up your workspace in the same way I've done here. Okay, so as I was saying, we've got one light in our scene. And we're going to go for a 3-point lighting system, which I've talked a little bit about before, but we're going to go into a bit more detail now. We'll start off with top view, and I'll bring this around to the front, so G to grab and bring it around to the front. And this will be the key light, so probably the most important light in the scene, and already it's giving us a nice look to our character. I'll go to the light properties, or the object data properties. I want to change the color to give it a slight yellow tint. That creates a bit more warmth, as you can see there. The power of 1000 watts should be fine, and I'm going to change it to an area light and grab this yellow dot to point it towards my character. Now the great thing about area lights is we can soften the shadows or harden the shadows by changing the size. So the shadows currently are very hard, so the edges are very sharp like this. I can zoom in a bit and you can see them there and down here. If I were to make my light bigger, so I'll press S to scale and scale it up so it's somewhere around here, you can see the shadows become a lot softer. I'll zoom out just a touch, and for something to look a bit sinister and aggressive, hard shadows are quite good. So I'll decrease the size of my light and make these shadows quite hard. So pause the video and catch up with me. Change the position of your light so it's pointing down towards the front of your character from the right hand side like this, and change the size of the light so it's similar to mine. So fairly small. And I'll press N on my keyboard so you can see the scale. It's roughly 9.6. So anywhere near there should be fine. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll press N to get rid of that toolbar. So that's the first light, and possibly the most important because it's the one that's illuminating our character the most. The second light, if I come round to roughly top view here and Shift D to duplicate that light, is from the other side. So I'll point that one inwards as well. This is known as the fill light because it fills in some of those shadows and stops them being so dark. And this time we want a very soft light here. So I make it really big. We choose a soft light so we don't add too many shadows. And you can see it kind of kills the shadows somewhat and it looks a lot more flat. But if I reduce the power to something like 300, then we bring some of those shadows back, but we also manage to light up the other side slightly. We could even change the color of this, maybe make it slightly more reddy, which will give it a bit more intensity. And let's just have a look around our character a bit and see how that's looking. So this side is still a lot darker because this is a much less powerful light, but we want to be able to see that other side of the character, so we make it slightly dark but not too dark, hence the fill light. If I press H, I can hide that light, and then Alt H will bring it back, and you can see the influence of that light. So there's without, lots of shadow, and there's with the light. Now you could argue, if I press H, that this is a bit more intense, and Alt H, it loses some of that intensity as we brighten up that area. So maybe bringing it down to 100 might help more. So H to hide, Alt H to bring it back. That's a little bit too dim now, so probably 200, and again H and Alt H, and we can see the difference there. Perhaps somewhere in between, about 150. So a little bit of experimentation this. So H and Alt H, there we go. Just a little bit of light from this is helping to light this side slightly, and that way we can still see the details in our character. So pause the video and catch up with me, creating an area light on the other side, and you can just duplicate the one over here, make it much bigger, of course pointing at our character again, but reduce the power to something like 150 and maybe give it a little bit more color, perhaps towards the reds. Pause the video and have a go at that. The last light we use is a backlight, so I'll come back to the top here, select one of these again, Shift D to duplicate, bring it round to the back and point it at our character. Now I tend to like to have a fairly low light, so going fairly straight like this towards our character, and that's pointing upwards very slightly. It doesn't have to, it can be fairly straight like this, and usually from one side, so I'll just rotate that in the Z, maybe bring it across a little bit more round about here, so just off to the side, and you can have one from the other side as well, which can also help, but I'll show you that in a second. So for our backlight, again, I'll just press H to hide, and you can see it offers quite an outline and separates the character from the background. So when I press Alt H to bring it back, you can really see the influence of that. So H to hide, Alt H to bring it back. I might rotate it a little more and bring it further round to the back, and try that again, H and then Alt H, and you can see this sort of glow on the outside of our character. Before I was getting a bit too much on the chin, I felt, that's why I moved it further round. So H and Alt H, and I think that's working well. Now what I like to do with this one is I like to increase the power of this, so to 3000, and it gives it this really intense glow in the background there. And I often like to go for a blue for a backlight, It's very good for stylized characters. As you can see there, we've got this sort of blue outline which looks quite interesting. So pause the video here and create your backlight. It's a similar size to our key light, so nice and small, and therefore gives hard shadows. It's very powerful to 3000 watts, and I like to give it a blue color. And it comes from behind like this. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, now we can start really experimenting. I feel like this side needs a little bit of separation from the background as well. So I can duplicate this backlight, Shift D to duplicate, and bring it round this way. And suddenly we've got this shoulder standing out, and I can come around here and you can see some intensity from that side as well. I feel like this will probably be our finished angle, and we've got a nice blue glow around there, maybe a little bit further round to around here, and that's looking quite nice. You might even want to animate a camera to show the whole of your character, but that's working well, I think. We can also experiment with some of the positioning of, let's say, the fill light. We could bring it much lower and pointing upwards like this, and you can see that creates a different kind of look, giving a bit more of a glow to this side. You could even experiment with turning it a bit more green, which can also change the feel. I think I prefer the red glow though myself, but I could try a bit more saturation, and that's quite interesting in itself. So that's from low down. We could try it from much higher up, somewhere around here. I'll bring it a little bit closer. That will increase the intensity slightly. The distance from the subject does make a difference to how bright it is, and I'll move that across to there. And that's working in a very interesting way as well. And for an experiment, I could try moving this to different angles. Our key light here, that looks very odd and almost glary, but let's try it from a low angle down here. That looks very sinister and very unusual. But it's good to try these things and see how you get on. I much prefer the original angle, so I'm going to move it back up to there. Again, I could try a little bit more warmth this time, so coming across the oranges a bit more there, and that creates a very interesting look. And I quite like what we've got here. The last thing I do want to do is just go to the render properties and turn on screen space reflections as well. It's not offering an awful lot, but you can sometimes see the reflection in the eyes, and that can help a little bit. So just in here you can possibly see a bit of a reflection. There's not much going on. You'd see more if you were in cycles, but I want to keep this to Eevee to show you what you can produce with this instant render. Of course, let's quickly check cycles and see what that looks like. We've got a much softer look here, and I'll just turn the denoise on so it's a little bit faster. It looks a lot less intense, so we'd certainly have to reduce the power of some of the lights, maybe make them smaller for harder shadows and so on. So I'll go back to Eevee, which I think has a better intensity to it for this stylized character that we've got here. So your challenge then is to play with this 3-point light system. Of course, mine's a bit like a 4-point light system because I've got 2 backlights, but by all means play with that, maybe hide some lights to see what that looks like, change the colors, change the intensity, and see how you get on. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work and render out your work and share it with the community so you can get some feedback and chat to others about how they're getting on. I hope you've enjoyed the process of making this character and you've come up with something that you're proud of. I look forward to seeing your creations. So hopefully you've enjoyed the process and you've come up with something that's maybe similar to mine. Again, as always, don't panic if it's not similar. The most important thing is that you've finished the section and that you've had a go at the techniques. That's far more valuable than the outcomes, especially at this stage in your Blender journey. Taking things further, you could try the same process with a different character. What's often a little easier is maybe a beast of some description. With human faces, it's easy to recognize when something's gone wrong, but it's a lot easier if you sculpt a beastly creature. Now, as I said in the section, these models are very high poly, which in many ways does limit their use. They're great as artistic pieces and concept art and also work well for 3D prints. However, to use these models in films or games, you would need to do what's called retopology. This is the process of taking a high poly sculpt and turning it into a low poly object. Now, as always, do remember to share your work with myself and Game Dev TV, as we love to see how you're getting on. And not just on the community, but on social media as well. Make sure you tag us. Thanks very much for taking the course. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'm excited to see your work.